We're going to talk today about Guidepost 2, which is parts of self. I will link all the guideposts below in the description as we're doing them. We'll update. But parts of self is one that I think, as we've gone through each guidepost together, parts of self is one of those ones that has always, like, I find each guidepost more and more profound, but parts of self was something that really helped me understand my emotions. So I have a special fondness for this guidepost because I don't think a lot of people always talk about this stuff. I think we talk about our feelings and things as like, I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm whatever, but we don't always talk about parts of self and what that actually means and what person is at the table. And it's changed the way I communicate, but I can keep going on. But I wanted to see if you would give just a quick overview of the guideposts and then talk to me a little bit about what parts of self is.
Okay. So the guideposts, there are 5 of them. I say the first 4 go above the numerator line, as I like to call it, and in the numerator column, and then the last one goes down below in what I would call the common denominator, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But that's sort of the framework. So there's 4 on top of the line, and then 1 below the line is sort of the common denominator, the last guidepost. The first guidepost on the top of the top 4 is mindfulness, and that is just paying attention to your thoughts and to your feelings. All right, being able to dial into what's going on inside of us. It gets us out of our knee-jerk responses to things. We can take a pause, we can take a breath, we can start assessing where we're coming from, what we're thinking, what we're feeling. So again, that we're not in that sort of reflexive response to our partners or to the things in our lives. And that puts us in a really powerful place. It's the place I like to call choice. So that's mindfulness, guidepost 1. Guidepost 2 is parts of self. And so I use mindfulness as sort of the gate key, the universal remote to all of these guideposts, because we have to be, if we're to know what part of us shows up, we need to be mindful and aware that we have parts and that we have a part showing up. We just kind of think changing mood. I'm happy one minute, I'm sad another, I'm angry. What we're finding out is no, in fact, we have these versions of ourselves, these parts of us, these sides of our personality. And when I start getting a little bit deeper into it, people start going, oh, right. Yeah, no, I do that. And what that speaks to is compartmentalization of the mind. The brain is a compartmentalized organism. Think of it like a submarine, right? Each compartment of the submarine can be cordoned off and locked off so that you only have experience of that particular aspect of the sub. Well, your brains can be the same way. And when we get locked into these parts of us, it's sometimes for the good and sometimes for the not so good. So the good is, let's say you're going to work, and because you go to work, most days, you see the people, the same sights, the same stimuli, the same smells, all of a sudden you're in state, you're in your work version of yourself. And that's probably a particular aspect of your personality. You behave a particular way. There are things that you will do as a professional that you wouldn't do in your personal life, and vice versa. Right. And so it's usually a pretty accessible one for folks. This sense that I have this work version of me, like the therapist version of self for me is a particular one. But we also have other parts of us. We have parts of us that are charged with protecting us. We have our wounded parts. We have our inner critic. And what we want to do in this way of working is really dial into the parts of us that show up, because our parts dictate so much of how we interact, as you might imagine. We'll get more into that as we move in this conversation about parts. But moving the conversation along, speaking generally about the guidepost, the third guidepost is narrative. And the narrative speaks to the stories that we tell in the back of our minds. One of my clients described it aptly when she said, it's like this little ticker tape that I have rolling in the back of my mind every day, all of the time, about my husband. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not so good. Here's the thing. We buy into our narratives. We think these thoughts, they're sort of quiet often. in the back of our minds. We think no one else is hearing it. So, we might as well go ahead and be like, that's fucking stupid.
Mm-hmm.
That's not good naked. Those types of narratives, they're often judgments. The problem is those thoughts can become feelings. And if we do that enough, those feelings and those thoughts will congregate and they will become our beliefs. So before you know it, you can end up with some pretty not so great beliefs about your partner, things that are not going to help you navigate the test of time, as it were, with each other. And it's pretty hard to unpack them and to parse them out. And that can be pretty tough work because it's sort of ingrained in there. And we can talk about neuroplasticity and all of that when we get further down the line in mindfulness and when we talk about the narrative. The fourth guidepost is choosing. And the choosing guidepost is, at first blush, it's really our love language. We kiss the way we like to be kissed. We touch the way we like to be touched. We tend to give gifts similar to the ones we might like to get. But when we become really mindful of that and attuned to our partner, we can look and say, well, you know what? They don't actually vibe with that type of love language. They have something else, and we can begin to speak that. The important thing to know around that is that it's not just, oh, that makes me feel good. It makes me feel loved and cared about. These love languages are linked directly to our wounded parts of self. They're linked to the thing we didn't get and the thing that we are so desperately trying to get in our love relationships. And so when we really peel back the wool, so to speak, on this whole thing, we see that my love language is if for instance, my love language is touch. The fact that someone would reach and touch me and hold me physically makes me feel loved and cared about. It makes that part of me feel like I'm worth something. It makes that part of me feel like it's safe enough in the world, perhaps, or that I matter to them, right? And so these love languages are directly linked to our wounding. And when we start talking about it at length, we can find the spiritual reason that, not the spiritual like God, but the spiritual reason that we have connected, that most often we are here to heal something within ourselves and to help heal something within our partners. And so those are the first four guideposts: mindfulness, parts of self, narrative, choosing. As I said before, big line under that. In the common denominator position, I put personal responsibility. I wanted it to be mindfulness because I'm a big mindfulness guy. But it's not. It's personal responsibility. That has to be the fifth and final guidepost, the guidepost that sort of wraps everything up. Because if I don't take responsibility for everything that I do and everything that I say, all is lost. As I tell my couples, there is no traction in what about you? There's a ton of traction in pointing that finger back at ourselves and saying, how mindful have I been? What are my thoughts and feelings? What part of me is showing up here? What's the story that part is telling? And am I picking you and choosing you in the way that you need to be picked and chosen? If I'm not, that's where the trouble starts. And so couples will go, well, this is what you need to be doing, and I need you to do that. Let's turn that all around. When we bring that back to ourselves and we start asking about my mindfulness, about the part of me and the story that I'm telling, and am I choosing my partner in the right way? This is when we can really move the needle for people. But that's kind of not how we're geared.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't like that uncomfortable accountability factor of
no. I'll take the blame for planning the good trip and doing the good deed and all of that stuff. But when you start telling me that I made you sad, then I don't want to own that.
No.
I'm sorry that you feel that way.
Right.
Fuck.
Oh, okay. All right. So that's a great overview of the guideposts.
I hope so.
It is. And, we're going to cover all of them, and, people will be able to watch and learn all of these different guideposts, and then we'll create more content about them. Because I think you can talk about all of them pretty endlessly. But let's get back to parts of self. So you touched on it a little bit, but what are my parts of self and why are they there? you know?
It's a good question. What are my parts? Now, your parts are just these aspects of your personality. And it depends on who you ask. Now, if you were to look at this from an internal family systems perspective, some people watching and listening may be aware of internal family systems. David Schwartz, I believe is his name. He came up with this model of working, which is essentially says, I have this family of parts in me. And I need to know what's going on within this internal family. And so he would say there's the firefighter, there's a manager, there's a defender part, there's the wounded child, there's the inner critic, all of these things. And none of this is new to the therapy game. Pretty much every form of therapy has some version of parts work within it. We can go all the way back to Freud, and he talked about the id, the ego, the superego. For my money, these are just aspects, parts of self. Jung had the complexes. We had to deal with our complexes. These complexes come up depending on what's going on in our lives. Virginia Satir later on said there's a parts party happening within us. We need to know who came to our party. I try to keep it really simple and say that there are just a few aspects, because look, if you want to dive down the internal family systems and you want to know about your manager or your firefighter and all these things, that's fine. But I find that, by and large, keeping it simple is important, because when people are fired up and they're triggered, I'm going to have a hard time like, wait, now is that a firefighter or is that my manager? I don't really know. Right. I want to know, like, I'm defending myself, or I'm really hurt, or both, or I'm being really critical right now. So that's what I do. I keep it simple. I keep essentially three. There's the defender, the inner critic, and the wounded child. It gets a little derivative when I talk about the defender, because we defend ourselves in particular ways. Like I'm a fighter. Some people flee. Some people will dissociate, and that's a form of flight. They'll just go up into the trees, and I'm going to wait till you're, done doing what you're doing. I'm just going to be here, emotionally out of the picture, doing something else. Those are ways. Think of fight, flight, freeze, and we get to freeze. And as I've talked with you about before, this is a particular one. When people freeze, is when I kind of push the pause button and talk about trauma. When I'm interviewing people and getting to know their parts of self, and they land on, well, I defend myself, I by and large I freeze, and I'll say, okay, so who's the predator? Because freeze denotes that there was something to be really afraid of. And if freeze is the answer, then I'm probably going to work with that person individually, or refer them out to a trauma specialist, because something probably happened that is, let them know that they needed to freeze, and there's a younger part of them that actually does that, and that needs to be looked at. The inner critic, the inner critic is essentially another protector part, but all of us, whether we are a fighter, a fleer, a freezer, or a runner, a fleer, we all have an inner critic. And that's that side of ourselves that everybody hates. When I bring that part up, I hate that part of myself. Can't we just get rid of that part? And I'll say, yeah, it's kind of like cutting off your own arm. You can't really do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, but you don't want to. And the inner critic, all of our inner critics kind of behave in different ways, but the thing that the goal that they have, the thing that they're trying to do is the same. And that's to keep us safe. And they do it through a toxic narrative. You aren't pretty enough. You aren't smart enough. You aren't talented enough to do that thing that you're trying to do. Stay in here, draw the blinds, keep your head down where it's safe. That's what this inner critic tells us to do. And oh, by the way, it also says everybody else is shit too.
Sure.
And so when you're engaged with the inner critic, you can know that, because there is sort of a toxic narrative of, no one is any good and neither am I. Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. And when I know it's the inner critic is like, I feel like kind of sick to my stomach. Like, when you hear that negativity and you have like that gut reaction to it, you're like, okay, pause for a second. Like, why are we having this conversation? Kind of thing. And so how do we, so if we're able to look at, an argument and I'm getting angry, do I automatically assume that that's the defender? Or like, are parts of self tied to specific emotions, or are they does it depend on the situation?
Well, look, I'm not going to say that, it's a great question. Whether it's true or not, it actually kind of works really well this way. If I'm angry, I'm reacting to something, right? Underneath your anger, I think anger is a secondary response to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So it essentially says, yes, it's your parts.
Mm-hmm.
Someone's done or said something and you've become angry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's probably more there. There's a wounded child part underneath that. That made you angry for a reason and you decided to protect yourself, right?
That
You
makes
felt
sense.
sad. You felt hurt. You felt guilty. So you decided to protect yourself in the way in which you do that. If you're angry, it's the angry defended part of yourself pushing back, drawing a boundary.
Gotcha.
Ideally, what we're going to do is become very, very mindful and aware of that part and negotiate with that part. And we can talk about what that is later, to have that part step aside. And ideally what we want to do is we want to like have all these parts sort of step aside and do what's called a naming process so that the wise self can then come to the table. We want to spend as much time in our wise adult self, our healthy self, as we possibly can. As we sit there. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask that, like, what is the, if the parts of self are all players on the field, like who's the referee, like what is that? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about,
that's the wise self.
Yeah. Let's talk about that and what that is.
So I like to tell my clients that there is a seat of consciousness, if you will, that lives somewhere in here. And we want to be aware of the aspect of self that is currently residing in that seat. And the wise self doesn't care what kind of experience. If you want to get mad, great, get mad. Let's see what happens there. If you want to be wounded and in your sad parts, great, let's do that. And if you want to be inner critic, look, we can do that too. That's fine. The wise self is very Taoist, I think, in its way. It's whatever you want to do is what we're going to do, and I'm not going to push back against that. The wise self is the aspect of self, I think, that's closest to our soul, closest to our essence and our spirit. It's when our other sides of self have sort of stepped aside and are on the field, as you say, or as I like to imagine, that they're all sitting around a big old table out back in my house. I've told you before on Kauai that I don't own yet, but hopefully one day will.
Yeah.
And they all have a seat and everybody's welcome. All my parts, all my wounding, all of my defenders, my inner critic is welcome. And everybody gets a seat and everybody gets a say as to what's going on. But there's only one part that gets to drive the ship, hopefully, if I'm operating through awareness and through mindfulness, right? And so when you call the roll and you say, okay, there's my defender part. Yep, I'm very angry. That means I'm hurt. Oh, hey, little guy, there you are. I knew. I have a seat. And then all of a sudden the inner critic goes, well, this is a bunch of bullshit. Who believes this is crazy? You're talking to yourself. I hear you. Have a seat. I knew you'd come. And as you sort of do this inner roll call of the parts of selves, then that wise self steps forward. You're immediately in the wise self, in the healthy self.
I love that analogy because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. Because it is like a family. Like it is, it's your own little internal family.
And it has to be an all-inclusive model, even the parts of yourself that you don't like. Because if we don't acknowledge these parts of us, and this is by and large why I have a job, when people don't acknowledge their parts, these parts go into shadow and they come out sideways. And they come out at times when it's the least convenient.
And I remember first learning about parts of self with you. And the first thing I thought was, I'm going to have like 20 billion parts and I don't know how to wrangle that. So I'm glad we already touched on like the simplification of it. But the other thing I thought was our job is going, and this is just, obviously initially it was, our job is going to be to phase these parts of self out. And it never was, like, it has never been, like, it's really about embracing them and accepting them at the table, like with your analogy.
Well, if you think about it, what has happened by and large, and part of the reason why we get so wounded is somewhere along the line, we felt like we were not loved, right? We're not good enough. we're not safe,
Mm-hmm.
we're not welcome. That's all wounding. And so by including all the parts and saying, no, you're all welcome here. That part of you that was wounded in junior high or in high school or in my family of origin, that part that felt so excluded and so not welcome, so not available to public consumption. We're saying, no, in fact, you are welcome here. You're always welcome here. You have to be here. This is that all-inclusive model that brings these parts back into the fold and gets us closer to wholeness.
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. So, I mean, we've touched on it a little bit in terms of like embracing them, but how do I speak to each part individually? Like, obviously I'm going to be in my YSelf when I'm doing it, but how do I talk to my defender? How do I talk to, my wounded child, my critic?
Well, the first step, and that's why, and I will belabor these points over and over again, because mindfulness is the hardest thing about mindfulness is remembering to do it. And through mindfulness practice, being aware that, oh, I'm doing that thing. I'm feeling that way. I'm saying that thing that I always do. That's the part of me that's here. By becoming aware that part is up and present, that's the first step. Because most of the time we are just sort of on autopilot, living our lives, being who we think we are, and reacting as we normally would, and we're wholly unaware that you were asleep at the wheel, and these parts have taken it. We've been hijacked. So mindfulness is the first step in recognizing that there's a part to be spoken to. And so it sounds silly, but naming how you're feeling, naming what you're thinking. I'm angry right now. I'm really angry. Oh, there's a defended part of me is here. I'm feeling I really have to push back. So there's obviously a wounded part of me that's here too. And so the how of this is to turn to that part of you that, in my case, the fighter, and say, hey, great job. I've loved you. Man, have you taken care of me when I couldn't? You tend to break eggs with sledgehammers. And you're not a great dad. We've seen that. And you're a terrible partner. Other than that, great.
So glad you're here.
So glad. Like if there's a bar fight, awesome. Totally need you for that. In this version of my life, I don't particularly want a bar fight, need a bar fight, or someone to take me through that. But you can sit there, and that would be great if you do that.
Right.
So, I'm being a little facetious, but like that's actually in negotiations. Like you talk to the part, and you say to them, "I see you," and you thank them, and you're appreciative because they have done the best that they could in a very difficult situation. Something happened when you were a kid, and as we get a little bit older and we start growing into our power, this part of us steps up and says, "No more," and that might mean like a dissociative pattern. That might mean you flee. That might mean you get real critical. But you say to that part, hey, it's time. I need you to step aside, because behind that part is the wounded child part. And this is the aspect that you didn't get, the thing that was missing. And that might have been enough love from your parents. That might have been connection to community. That might have been inclusion. Am I safe? Am I loved? Do I matter? Am I enough? All of those questions. And you look at that little part of yourself that looks remarkably like you, right? I always tell my clients, I say, you look at that little face that's, remarkably reminiscent, with eyes that look remarkably like the ones that are staring back at me right now. And you say, hey, I see you. I'm here. I know I wasn't for a really long time, and I'm so sorry. But you are safe. You are loved. You are enough. You do matter. You are welcome here. I need you to be here. And I have my clients actually imagine like holding that version of themselves. It was Carl Rogers he really turned psychotherapy on its head. Before it was all a lot of analysis and a lot of people going,
Right.
And not really getting in there with you. And that has its place. Everything sort of stands on the shoulders of those guys as far as psychotherapy is concerned. But Carl Rogers came in, the first like humanist, and said that, every client that comes through your door is missing something. It's important for you to figure out what that is. we find that in the wounded child.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an overly used cliche term, and people go, wounded child. I'm like, yeah, no, you got them. Trust me.
Right.
None of us gets through this without getting a little dinged up.
Right.
And so we have to speak to that. And so the acknowledgement of the wounded child and speaking to that part and holding that part of self gives us a little taste of that thing we didn't get, and brings that part back into the fold. And we get a little bit closer to wholeness.
So this is a little bit of a trick question, maybe, but like, this makes sense to me, and I could see ways that I could put this into practice of, like, journaling, or, just mindful conversations with myself and things like that. But what do you do when you're in the moment and you're having a fight with your spouse, or you're, something happened at work, and you're like, what do I do when that part of self comes up, and I, maybe I have just enough mindfulness to recognize I'm here. How do I navigate in the speed of things? You know what I mean?
Well, practice, of course, makes perfect on this. And so doing what you were talking about, journaling, meditating, spending time when you set aside that quiet time to actually recognize the parts, that's a really good way to get a little more proficient. Now, look, when it's happening in the moment, you're fighting a lot, right? There is a biochemical tide that's happening within your body of things firing off, putting you into state. Right? You've had those thoughts that are becoming feelings. You're angry, you're hurt, you're pissed, whatever it is. And I'm telling you, like, push pause.
Right.
Let's take a moment.
There is no fucking pause button.
Yeah. And so I've gotten to a point now, and with a little, like, look, the thing is when it's happening and you're in this argument with your partner, and something is done, something is said, you're going to feel like you deserve to say this thing. You should say this thing. How can you let this go? Everything in you is going to want to dig in for the fight. And there's going to be a lot of, like, rhetoric going on in here that tells you this is a good plan. Later on, we're like, that was a really bad plan.
That wasn't it wasn't even a plan.
There wasn't. I didn't see anything.
The blueprints are gone.
Not here.
And so what
right. So I stop and push pause. Just it can happen in a breath. And I know when Ashley and I've gotten into it here or there, and that part of me comes up, it's like, he's like right here. He's like, did you hear that? I heard that. Did you hear that? Right? What the fuck was that? You know what you should say right now? Say that. And I'm like, man, I know what kind of trouble you're going to get me in. I'm going to have to apologize for that shit later. Yeah. And I've gotten to that point now where I'll go, okay, there's a part of us that knows where that's going. But we sip the Kool-Aid on that. We're like, yeah, I'm not going to let someone get away with that. But this falls back on our personal responsibility aspect, right? Our guidepost of, no, I've got to own my shit. And this part of me is coming up and it's telling me some stuff that I know is not going to go well. Like, it might be perfect for the moment. But tomorrow or later on, it's not going to feel perfect. It's going to have gone sour. And so what we get to is, I see you. I know you're here. And that hurt this kid part of me. But now I'm in my YSelf, and I can hold that space, and I can be the container for that relationship that I'm in, and see it beyond the discourse that's happening in this moment, and say, hey, I don't want to talk to you like that. Right? Like, hey, I don't, we shouldn't ever treat each other this way. Right? And immediately when someone sees you doing that, they kind of step back, and they may stay in that fighter part and go, well, and you go, I know that back and forth was not my best effort, and I'm sorry. Let's do this again, or let's take 5, or let's push pause on this for a moment. And I did this once to Ash because I had definitely stepped in it with her, and I was totally in the wrong. And the thing, and I'll spare you all the details, but the thing that I said to her was, when she was telling me what she had experienced, I said, and I was standing on this little ground, this piece of turf that she could have told me how she was feeling in the moment, and it came out like this. Well, the last time I checked, you had a mouth.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh no.
Oh.
And I went, you son of a bitch, you said it.
What did I
son of a
say?
bitch. Look at what you did. And I went, as it was coming out, I was like, no, trying to put it back in my mouth, in my hole, back in the hole from whence it came, right? This bullshit. Even I knew it was bullshit. First of all, it was bullshit. It was bullshit to say it to her, to say it to her that way.
Oh yeah, there was
all
a
that
whole
I knew
lot.
it.
Yeah,
yeah, and it was crappy and just bush league and all that stuff. But like, people will stay and like, yeah, last time I checked, you had a mouth. And then defend that shit.
Right. Yeah.
There I was in my kitchen defending that. And as I said it, I said, no. And she turned, like, in her little back all stiffened up. Like she was gonna like, she doesn't ever do this. She was going to walk out of the room. I'm like, ah. Yeah. And I go, stop. Like, I'm sorry. And I checked that part of me and I went, no more out of you, son of a bitch. and I found that, found that space, the spaciousness within me, the compassion, the empathy, and the understanding that whether I intended to or not, her feelings were hurt by something. I do care about that in some aspect of self.
Sure.
Not the protector part. He doesn't give a shit. But this part of me does. And I said, I am so sorry for speaking to you that way. I should have never said that. That was assholic. It was assholic for me to have said that to you. And she stopped, and I could see like she started to kind of slack a little bit. I was like, yeah. Right. And it's like the Jedi mind trick. Right? Yeah. And so she turns around and she looks at me and she goes, you're doing that thing. I said, yeah, I am. And you're probably glad I'm doing it. Yeah. She said, I am. Yeah. She said, thank you. So rather than that devolving down into more, emotional hand grenades, it became a hug in the middle of the room. I'm not going to lie to you. I think I may have gotten laid.
I bet you did. You warmed that engine right back up.
That's what I call it the panty dropper.
Emotional awareness.
Yeah. So what you do is you start a fight and then immediately you try to fix it. It's a great plan. No, I didn't.
Go to lairtorrent.com to book your therapy.
Yeah. Come on in. The water's fine.
All I can think of when you're telling this story is growing up in Wisconsin, and you got in your dad's like old Buick or some old like Ford pickup truck or whatever, and he was always like,
after you unplug the engine. Because
it's cold as yeah. Yes. And
right.
He would be like, now you got to pump the gas a couple times before you turn the key in the ignition. And that was you pumping the gas. Yeah. Furiously pumping the gas.
Trying to resuscitate my marriage. Yeah. So that was one of those moments where I was like, this shit really works. Yeah. Parts of self and a little personal responsibility goes a long way.
Right. Just a little sprinkling of personal
just
responsibility.
Just a skosh.
Just a skosh, baby.
Just a pinch.
So I'm walking away from this. I've watched the video. I grasp parts of self. What do I do now? How do I start all of this?
Noticing, looking at your life and noticing like, okay, so I have people do this thing. I call it chunking out your day because I couldn't come up with a shittier name. It just doesn't, I don't know why. We have chunks of our day.
Yeah.
In the morning I wake up and I usually have time with my family before I go to work, where, the work chunk is therapist self. But prior to that, when I wake up, I stop, I push pause, and I ask, who's here? As silly and as weird as that may sound, I ask what part of me goes down these stairs, pours that coffee, interacts with this person that I call wife, and these other little people that I call children. And, but when I do that, it becomes intentional time.
Mm-hmm.
When I do that, I'm more aware of the version, because look, we can all wake up a little crusty.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who has kids would know trying to get those, little inconvenient turds out the door is not easy, right? It's like anyone who doesn't put their shoes on. Seriously,
Right.
put them on. What do you mean you don't know where they are? Again, right? All of that. And that can really ride your last nerve. And so these parts of you that are protecting, like, I got to get to work on time. I need more organization. I need more peace in the morning. That part of you protecting all of that stuff can get really up. And before you know it, you're barking, you're yelling, you're screaming, and you don't want to do that. But asking yourself who shows up is a real help.
Mm-hmm.
And so wherever I'm going, I'm taking a look at what part of me is showing up. If then on the way to work, I kind of know who's going to show up there.
Mm-hmm.
On the way back home, there was times where I would open the door and then I would shut the door really quick, and the kids would be like, "Hey," and Ashley would go, "Well, he's doing that parts thing. He's making sure he knows who shows up," because I have it linked up that when I touch the doorknob, I ask myself, who comes home, who shows up here, because I want to make sure that I'm showing up in the best version of myself for them as I can, because frankly, they deserve it.
Sure.
It gets really fun when you have things that you want to do well at, like a job interview or a presentation. And if you're nervous and you're scared, this really does help with how we function at a higher level, right? Rather than devolving down into our nerves, into our fear, we can find that aspect of self that can come to the table. And we should probably talk about that in the next installment of this.
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
High performance in the parts of self.
I love that idea. I have one more question for you, which is, how long did it take you to get here? Because I think it's important for people to understand that this is not necessarily an overnight thing, that it takes time to work on this muscle, the YSelf muscle, and acknowledge all of this other stuff and all these parts. Like, how long did it take you to get to the point that you were touching a doorknob and instinctively asking yourself that question?
I don't know, maybe I should turn that question on you, since you are the one who's been recently dabbling in this. Like, how was it for you to hear these things that these folks are now hearing, to come to some understandings around these aspects of yourself? How long did it take you?
Yeah, so I think I have just recently started getting pretty good at my parts of self. Like, I know exactly how I started this conversation, having to talk to you about videos and things like that. And I know, you know, like, I know exactly who came to the table for these various conversations. And I'd say that, we've been talking for about a year. So, but I think it's important to note that there are a lot of phases you go through as you're dealing, well, at least for me, as I was dealing with my parts of self, of like, what are my different protectors? What are my wounded children? And I remember distinctly sitting in your office pre-COVID and you talking to me about the wounded child, and I was sobbing, and I did not want to talk to that part. Like, I didn't want to deal with that part. Like, there's a whole lot of like trauma and wounding around that. And it took me a while of being like, okay, no, I do need to talk to this part. And this part is a very sad, lonely, rejected piece of myself that I need to embrace, because if I don't, the world is never going to be kind to it.
Well, the interesting aspect to that is that when we do that, and I go, I don't really want to deal with you, we're actually recapitulating much of the wound that was already there and saying, you're not fit for public consumption. I don't want to deal with you either. You're too much.
Right. And that took a long time for me to like wrap my head around. I remember walking out, and I also remember you saying, look, a lot of shit comes up when we talk about this. So if you need me, call me. Like, and you're right. Like, a lot of you go through this weird sort of fugue as you're doing it of like, okay, I've really got to address these parts. But I feel like I am 100% stronger than I was when I first met you because of it, because I feel a lot more in control of myself. So I think, I would say short answer, about a year. But I'm not touching doorknobs and remembering to ask myself yet. So I have a ways to go.
I was just going to make some joke about touching your doorknobs and smelling your fingers, but I'm going to leave that alone. Because that would be something we should dig into and talk about. Like, what part of you is doing that?
And why? What happened?
So, I would say yes, proficiency in all of that and dialing in and dialing out, because people tend to do that. But often people see some pretty immediate results when you are suddenly become conscious of these wounded aspects of self. Sometimes, and I use this term very delicately and not often, there's almost a miraculous element to it when you feel a sense of wholeness and healing that perhaps you've never felt before. Now, the work continues and the parts do what they do, and we go on autopilot because that's what your brain's used to doing. So that's what that year is. And I would say that's a pretty, 6 months to a year of like kind of practicing, because again, the brain is filtering 400 billion bits of information per second. And we are on autopilot most of the time. You're training your brain to be more mindful, to be more aware, and to look at the side of yourself, and to then look at the side of you that's coming up. So that can take a little time. But when you start this work, people are often like, oh my God, that's crazy. I feel that's a whole bunch of those wounded parts are no longer there, is often what I hear. There are often some stragglers, and those are the ones that we really need to dig into. Those are the ones you really need to spend time with almost on the daily.
Yeah. So like and subscribe and hit the bell, the notification bell, which is right down here somewhere. So you get updated when we post new videos.
Right on.